Hello, Mason here. After holidays, there's usually a bunch of leftover food. This case, I got leftover turkey. I thought it'd be cool to throw together a lasagna with it, just to show that you can throw stuff together and make a half-decent lasagna that tastes delicious without making a mountain out of a molehill. Let's go. And to begin, we're going to be making our own noodles from scratch, just because it's super easy to do and they taste far better than the ones that you get from the store. So I have 2 eggs here and 200 grams of flour. 100 grams of flour per egg is the generally accepted rule for the amount. It usually works out pretty good, or it's close enough most of the time. Eggs don't usually come all in the same sizes, so we just kind of mix that all together until we get a nice cohesive dough, and that's just fabulous. We're going to be pressing this out later, so once we get it all mixed together, I'm just going to stick it in a plastic bag and then just kind of set it aside to let it rest or whatever it is it does. So to begin, we're going to be making a roux. So I have half a cup of butter, half a cup of flour, and 1.5 cups of cream. Digging around in the fridge, I found a package of mushrooms, and then I also found some ricotta. I didn't have that much left over, but I'm going to use it anyway. Package of frozen broccoli, and then I grated some mozzarella cheese, and there's my turkey. So we're going to begin by just blending up these mushrooms. I have a hand blender here. It works really good for this type of stuff, so I just dump all the mushrooms in there and then I can kind of go to town on it. And these were just ingredients that I had kicking around in the kitchen. If I was actually making a official lasagna, I would do things drastically different, but this was just a way to use up the leftovers so I didn't have to eat just turkey on its own, because we all ran out of gravy 2 days ago and that's just no good. So this was a good alternative to make a lasagna because we're out of gravy. Now we'll go over to our stove top and we can start the process. So getting a nice big pan out, something that we can cook a lot of stuff all at once in. Perfect. We'll go for a medium heat on there, maybe a little bit medium high. And then we'll get another pan out, a saucepan, and we'll use that for making our roux. Again, we'll go for a kind of a medium type of heat on it. We don't want anything too crazy with our roux. As you can see, or as you will be able to see later in this video, it can get out of hand pretty quick. So now we'll just dump in all of our broccoli into the big pan, and that's just fabulous. And now that we have our broccoli in the big pan, we're going to add our butter into the small pan. Now with our butter here, what we're going to do is we're going to be making our roux. So we just kind of let our butter all melt until our butter is all nice and hot. And once our butter is all nice and hot and melted, then we can add in our flour. And the general rule with the roux is that you have equal parts flour as you do butter. And then it will just kind of make this weird type of slurry thing. And we're just going to keep our roux moving around. There's 2 tricks to the roux. One is to keep it moving, and the other is to cook it long enough so that the taste of the flour kind of goes away. So 2 or 3 minutes of intense stirring and cooking, and your roux will be ready for the next step. And our next step, of course, will be to add our cream to it. And this is done by simply pouring the cream all in, and then more mixing shall ensue. We're just going to keep mixing this thing as much as we can. I switched over to using the whisk here because that seems to work a little bit better now that it's more of a fluid type mixture. And in a couple minutes it's going to really start to thicken up. And once it starts to thicken up, you just take it off the heat. Of course, you could always do what I do and mess around doing silly things trying to maximize, and you let it sit too long and it really starts to thicken up, and then it's a little bit on the thick side. And something you can do then is add a little bit more milk or cream to it and kind of thin it out a little bit, so that way it's not super duper thick, but this stuff tastes amazing. I usually add nutmeg to this, but I didn't in this particular instance for no particular reason. The other thing you might want to do is use like crushed garlic at the start and crush that in at the beginning, and that can really add a lot more flavor to it as well. So back over to our broccoli. So I'm just going to dump in my mushrooms into the broccoli now that I've got a few minutes of cooking on them. You don't want to have your broccoli hard as a rock when it's inside of your lasagna, so we just add in our mushrooms and then we can toss in our meat as well. And we're just going to let that cook while I roll out the noodles. So just going to get some cooking on there, that way it's nice and heated through and the broccoli's nice and done, and it's just all kind of mixed together in a nice fantastic mixture of excellent taste. Now we're going to move on to making our noodles, and as you can see here right at the start, it's not really going into the pasta machine that good, so I had to take it out and flatten it by hand before sticking it in. If you want to get one of these things, I got links in the description. The pasta machines really make making the noodles quite trivial. Otherwise you can use a rolling pin. It's not a big deal. You just roll them out till they're flat, and then you roll them out till they're thin. So it's quite a bit of rolling, but it's not that big of a deal. I've done it before. And if you're doing it with a rolling pin, you can even do like a full sheet and do the whole thing all at once, which is kind of neat to do. Not really practical, no real benefit to it, but it is what it is. So we're just going to keep running our noodles through this thing until they start to get nice and thin. So we just kind of run them through, then we turn our dial a little bit, and then we run them through again, and we just simply rinse and repeat until we have our desired thickness. If you go too thin, your noodles don't really have presence unless you have like 30 layers of noodles in your lasagna. If you go too thick, they don't necessarily cook properly. So not necessarily a right or a wrong way of doing this, but there is different preferences for how you want your stuff to turn out, so make it accordingly. I like having a little bit thicker noodles personally. I think it gives a little bit more texture to the noodles, or the right thickness. Our first major question is noodles first or filling first. I opted with filling first. You can do it either way. Well, I was going to say it doesn't make a difference, but it definitely does make a difference. And I find if you do filling first, it's easier to get it out of the pan, which is always kind of nice. And the bottom layer of noodles, if they stick, it can kind of be a little bit nasty to clean up afterwards, so there's always that. And once we got our first layer of filling down, then I'm going to spread out my cream sauce. A little bit thick in here, probably should add a little bit of cream, give it a little bit of a stir and kind of thin it out a little bit. But it is what it is, and that's just kind of what happens if you let your cream sauce cook a little bit longer than you should, but there's always kind of ways to recover from that, because the cream sauce just thickens up so quick when you're making it. And then we kind of just give the old distribution a little bit of a check, and then we add in our first layer of noodles. Something you can do here, or something you may want to do when you're making your own, is add cheese in each layer, either before or after. You could have your cheese right after the noodle. That's always good because the cheese can really stick to the noodles, and I don't know, I really like that texture. I do it on the last layer. Well, I'll show you when we're there, but just make sure we have full coverage of noodles after our first layer, and then we can start pouring down more of our filling. So we'll just dump that out as is. And the other thing to do is, if you're making your own, would be to cut up the broccoli into smaller pieces. That way your layers don't have to be super duper thick like this. But I think health wise, having less layers of noodles and big giant vegetables in your lasagna probably makes it slightly more healthy, and that's always a benefit. This health is somewhat important when it comes to food. And then we'll add in our layer of the cream sauce again, and do the same thing where we kind of spread it out and have a nice distribution. Of course, this time I think I might mix it up a little bit and add in some cheese. Now I think I added in the ricotta as well as the mozzarella before putting the final layer on top and then covering it with the mozzarella that I had left. But if you're making your own and you have time to go to the grocery store and it's not 4 o'clock in the morning when you're cooking this, cottage cheese is amazing to have in your lasagna. And that's kind of the big thing that I noticed that was missing in this one, was the cottage cheese. But then again, I was just kind of throwing something together to use leftovers, and I think this is pretty good for that. So once it's completely covered, we'll just throw it in the oven at 325, 350 degrees for about an hour, and then we're good to go. And we can start eating our delicious lasagna, and it tasted quite good. There's a lot of ways you can improve this. It's not going to win any competitions as far as best lasagna go, but as far as a really easy way to use up your leftovers and make something delicious, it's fabulous. So let me know in the comments below if you ever make anything like this with your leftovers. And if you like my content, please like and subscribe. And until next time, stay awesome.